Do that right now.
While you're setting up, I'll just say a few of the folks that joined. Thanks for joining. So my name is Christian Buckley. I'm a regional director of Microsoft MVP based here in Salt Lake City. This is part of our expert series with the Microsoft User Group Utah, or MUGIT. So thanks for joining, and Joel, it's great to have you. For those that don't know Joel, so he's a principal architect for Power Platform at Hitachi Solutions, and a 12-time, soon to be 13-time, right? You haven't done anything to mess that up, have you? In July?
Not that I know.
Yeah, but Joel does a ton in the space, in the dynamic side of things, so that's his specialty. And he also is the founder of the CRM audio podcast, and participates in the CRM tip of the day, which has been going for a long time. So it's great to have you here. And I like the background too. All right, and with that, I'll turn the time over to Joel. The hour is yours, and I guess I should say I've got the chat open and the Q&A going. Do you prefer to be interrupted with questions, or
Yeah, sure. Stop me whenever. If you have any questions, you feel free to stop me. I won't necessarily see the chat. Do you see my presentation right now, Christian?
Yep. Okay. Looks good.
Okay, great. So yeah, let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to do a combination of slides and also some show and tell as well, to hopefully keep this exciting in these weird times we're living in with everything being virtual. But hey, it's cool I could travel to Utah, so that's great. All right, so I'm Joel Lindstrom. Christian pretty much went over my bio. I've been doing this a long time. I started in 2007 and was doing a lot of on-premise business application deployment. Then moved to the cloud quite a while ago. My focus on Power Apps has been pretty much for about 2.5 years. And also Power Automate I've been doing for about 3 years now. So, and that's now my primary focus is Power Platform. So this is specifically about the Common Data Service, because our community is kind of comes from diverse backgrounds. You got the first people who really adopted Power Automate and Power Apps were the SharePoint users, because, for example, SharePoint replaced their workflow with Flow and their form designer with Power Apps. But then what we get into, Common Data Service, that's brought a lot of what you call Dynamics people. That's really the bus I was riding when I got to Power Platform. And so that's really what we're talking about. So what this session is for is to introduce you, if you're not familiar with it, to the Common Data Service and why you should use it. Now, I'll say up front, I'm not one that says you should always use Common Data Service. I built apps on SQL, I built apps on Excel, built a lot of apps on SharePoint. And I think there's definitely a place for every one of them. But my mantra is use the right tool for the job. And by understanding what Common Data Service is there for, you can understand when you should be using that versus SQL, SharePoint, Excel, some other solutions. So what is Common Data Service? Really quickly, it's a cloud data service. It's not a different kind of database, because it's actually the largest consumer of Azure SQL. It's using Azure Blob, but it's an abstraction of the core data technologies to give you a complete data platform. And it will take care of some of what I call the plumbing, or the underlying infrastructure that if you build on some other services, you gotta build for. It's a lot more than a database. So let's start with kind of where Common Data Service sits with the Power Platform. And when I say Power Platform, I don't want to assume everybody knows what Power Platform is. Power Platform is Microsoft's suite of low-code, no-code business application tools. It includes Power Apps, Power BI, Flow, now Power Virtual Agents. But the core of that is Common Data Service. Now, you can connect to other data sources, but Common Data Service is central to the Power Platform. And what it provides is easy structures, like there's common business entities inside of it. You might have heard of the Open Data Initiative that Microsoft has with SAP, Adobe, I think ServiceNow is on there as well. A growing number to take common business application entities specifically around the persona of a customer and standardize on that, so that integration between business systems becomes easier. And so Common Data Service is Microsoft's implementation of the Common Data Model. Now you can go and download the Common Data Model from GitHub. You can implement it in your custom SQL database. But the beauty is the Common Data Service comes with those standard entities for companies and contacts and activities and interactions and emails and things like that. So there's a standard way of doing it to support interconnected business applications. So we're
Hey, Joel,
seeing, yeah.
Can I ask a question? Are people, clients that you're working with, are they doing much with data that's being shared with Adobe and some of the other partners that are within that system? Because you don't hear much about that. Is that picking up steam?
A lot of that's behind the scenes, but what you're seeing that manifests itself in is some of the connectors that are coming out for Power Platform. But yeah, we haven't seen like everybody adopting the same model, but we are seeing through the partnership with Adobe and SAP, we are seeing certain things standardized in some of their latest releases.
Yeah, because I think for those that have participated in Microsoft Ignite or Inspire last year, actually spent some time over in the Dynamics booths talking with product team members, and they're big on the future of that and being able to share data across those systems. And like for me as a marketing technology guy, those marketing systems, being able to communicate with Microsoft CRM and the Dynamics platform, the collaboration data, getting access to the Microsoft Graph, and then leveraging like Marketo over under the Adobe brand and other tools. I mean, incredible possibilities there. But I'm ready to start seeing working examples of those things.
Yeah, I would say practically what I've seen is, from a Microsoft perspective, it's created an extra set of rigor around when they bring new features out or add fields that in the past they would do things that there was no way me as a partner could duplicate, because they would do things that they could set their own rules. Now you see updates to like the field service solution. It's a standard solution. You can see how it's built. So it's created more standard, and you can go get the Common Data Model, put it in your own. But as far as what we're talking about is Microsoft's implementation of that, which is the Common Data Service. And again, that is core to not just Dynamics, but also Power Apps, Power Automate, and all that. And we'll get into that a little bit more. So the origins, I'm not going to spend a lot on the history, but going back, it started with on-premises CRM. It started in 2003. And the point of this isn't just take a trip down memory lane. It's to say the Common Data Service isn't something that's brand new. It's something that has been built on a legacy of the data model and the structure, started with on-premise. But then around 2011 actually version 4 was the first CRM online. And that was when we hit 1 million users, which was huge for that time. But then growing for that, originally around 2016, 2017, they introduced this thing called the Common Data Service that originally was a separate database. It was its own thing that was used for building Power Apps and also mainly as a way to bring Dynamics, finance and operations, and CRM together. But they quickly learned that people didn't want a totally separate data platform, and they had a very good mature data platform in the data platform that Dynamics was based on. So in 2018, late 2017, actually, was when they came out with CDS 2.0, which is basically taking the data platform beneath Dynamics and saying, this is the Common Data Service. So instantly, integration possibilities, the structure, the security roles, all that stuff, which we'll talk about, became part of it right there. And that's where we are right now, where basically a lot of things that used to be considered Dynamics with a more expensive license, you can now leverage Common Data Service in your Canvas apps, your flows, and custom applications you build outside of that. You can leverage that platform. I mentioned this on Azure, but when people say it's just a database, it's a lot more than a database. It's a data platform that if you're building an app on SQL, which I've done, I think is a great option for certain things. If you want to account for authentication, if you want to account for security, if you want to account for granularity of records between one user A and user B and personas, you've got to do a fair amount of work. And building a data model, there's ways to quickly build a data model on SQL. I've used them, but Common Data Service provides an easier structure where somebody doesn't have to be a database administrator to add entities, add fields, but it scales, and these other technologies are used, and it's not always clear. So for example, the data is stored in Azure SQL. Attachments like images are stored in Azure Blob. Other pieces, logs and other things might be stored in Cosmos DB or other places like that. And then, it's all in Azure. So it works very well with Azure Service Buses, Logic Apps, and things like that. So, Common Data Service is a lot more than a database. If somebody just wants a database, I'll say, yeah, build on SQL. But you need to think about really what are you going to do beyond just building the app, because again, are you going to build an API? What are you going to do for user security? And I'll get into some security settings a little bit later. What about calculations, roll-ups, business rules, both server side and client side? What I see a lot of times, again, and when I built SQL apps, you wind up building a lot of the pseudo security into the app layer. And to me, I want real security to be at the platform layer. So whether you're looking at it in the data in Excel, whether you're looking at it in the app, whether you're looking at a report, that really is validated at all those levels. There's also some things around administration of data, like backups and restores, and storage and log files. We'll get into some of this stuff. But so let's get in more specifically into some of these scenarios. So when we talk about security, and I'll contrast with things like building an app on SharePoint lists. Very fast to spin up, very capable. I've seen some awesome apps, some things like MVP Shane Young does a lot of, he's got 1 million videos on YouTube, and they're really awesome. He does some CDS stuff too, but what I find is that SharePoint-based Power Apps are great until you need really granular security, because and correct me if I'm not claim to be a SharePoint expert, but as I understand it, your options are either list level, meaning you can get to the list or not get to the list, or they're records I create, I can see. Those two options. And so again, if there's other options, I don't want to speak incorrectly. But when you talk about enterprise apps, which is where I usually play, as I mentioned, security should be handled at the platform layer to be real security. Not if it's like convenient security, like, oh, I don't want to see 1 million records, just want to see the ones I care about. That could be handled in the app. But if it's really, we'll get fined by the SEC if people in this group see this data, or these two salespeople will steal deals from each other. And so CDS has a bunch of different security tools. So let me paint some scenarios. So let's take Bob. Bob's a manufacturing engineer. He's a plant. This was a real customer scenario where the company, the manufacturing company, got complaints from customers. And this was hilarious. It was a company that made paper products. So we're all aware of the empty toilet paper aisles right now. So they would literally have people count the number of squares in a toilet paper roll and call up and complain if it was 800 instead of 825, and try and get free stuff from them. And so when there's a problem at a plant, say there was a manufacturing issue, they would log a case, they called it a ticket, that would then be routed to Bob, the manufacturing engineer. We don't want Bob knowing who it was, because you never know. Bob might, if they had their home address, he might call them up and threaten them or something. So we needed to be able to control that he could see part of that record, but not the whole thing. And he shouldn't be able to see what's going on in the other plant. He might, we don't know how he'll use that information. Then you got Amy. Amy's a customer service rep. Now she works in a call center for Bob's same company, and she's the one that gets those tickets. So she needs to see the customer. She shouldn't see what's going on in other divisions, because there's some regulatory concerns that these need to be run kind of as separate businesses. But senior management wants to be able to see across everything. But for Amy, she should be able to see what people on her team or group or division are working on. Then you got Roy. And salespeople, and I can say this because I was one for about 10 years, salespeople care about one thing primarily: how much they're getting paid, okay? And a hungry salesperson like Roy, or sales manager, he cares about what his team does, but he also is, wanting to know what deals and leads are going to the other groups. And, he might try and take one of them. So, he shouldn't see sales, he should see what his salespeople have access to, but he shouldn't see what, the West group has. And you got Linda, she's the general manager. She should see everything. So, she should be able to see all those complaints, all those cases, the whole sales pipeline. So this is where, again, building this on a SQL database would be possible, but I would have to think of all those permutations, where CDS makes it pretty easy, because you've got, for example, we can give organization right to Linda. She can see everything. We got this thing called hierarchical security, where it's like hierarchy of users, where the salespeople can see what's assigned to them, and their manager can see up to like 3-4 levels deep. Business unit means my group or division, and then field level security, we can say these 3 fields aren't visible to these people, or only visible to these people. So very quickly we can use these constructs and these tools to handle almost any more complex security strategy. And this is what I talk to customers about, because they'll say, well, we just want to use the free Office license. It's not free, you pay for Office, but you know what I mean. So, but I will say that's fine. So it just asks, what's this going to become? Meaning, is any data in here have any special security handling? Is this going to grow? We're starting with this group now. What happens when we bring group 2, group 3, group 4 on? Do we want to, was it going to be open? Then sure. But if not, then we should consider using CDS. And there's other tools too. AD security teams is fairly new. A lot of people don't know about it, but I can basically set up an AD security group, or more likely use one that already exists. Then in a team record in the Common Data Service, link that AD object to the team. By doing that, anybody who's on that team instantly inherits the role of the team. I don't have to do anything as an admin to add a role to that person. And it's very, very good for large companies. It's also by far the fastest way to kick somebody out of the system, because the minute you leave that team, you're out of the system. So security is probably one of the primary things I would look at, and it's something that if you're building Power Apps or applications of any kind, don't just look at where you are today. Look what's coming 6 months, 12 months down the road, and making sure you're not going to hit a limit or hit a cliff that, oh, we gotta scrap this or move it someplace.
Hey Joel, we got a couple of questions.
Yeah.
Just posted. Are you talking about Azure Dynamic Groups when you say AD security teams?
Yeah, we're talking about, there's 2 options. One is the Azure AD Security Group, which is, again, you're all using AD Security Groups. The other one is same thing, but it's Office 365 group. So if you're not the Azure Global Admin or whatever, but you have access to create an Office group that isn't really an Azure security group, but really more of a grouping of people in Office 365, those can also play the same role. So the question is, do you have permission to set up? Because one thing we want to do is empower the administrator of the application to be able to do what he or she needs. If they have to go too far out and get other people, that can slow them down when they need to quickly change them. So you got both those options.
And the other question was, can we use CDS instead of SQL Server Database?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, CDS uses SQL in the back end, but it's a data service. So if you build your app on Power Apps, or you build your Power Apps on CDS, use Flow, use it for your flows, as well as build custom applications on it. Yeah, you could use it like you would use it. And most likely for complex applications, you can go to market faster that way, because the plumbing and the security and the other things I'm going to be talking about will just be faster to build out. Any other questions?
Nothing yet, but everybody, if you've got questions, you can use the Q&A module or write it in the chat. Either way works.
All right, so localization differences. So there's 2 main ones, which is multi-language, multi-currency. So SharePoint has multi-language, meaning it has multi-language for a SharePoint site. But what about within like a list where you want the field labels to have different language values? So, for example, we have multiple customers that have users, even domestically. Some speak Spanish, some speak English, but others have apps that are used, globally. And when you have something that's just in one group, that's one language, that's great. What happens when you need to see the field labels in different languages, or the option set list items? The people who speak French need to see the French options. Deploy an app to Canada, you'll have that scenario. So that's where the multi-language capability, it doesn't translate the data, but things like field labels, things like option set labels, which applies both in model-driven apps like Dynamics as well as Canvas apps. It's much more flexible. And the way multi-currency works is when I have a monetary value, it's actually storing two different fields. One is a base currency. So when you set up your CDS environment, you specify our base currency is euros, dollars, whatever. But then you can add additional currencies, and in the user preferences, associate currencies with users. That way, and then you can maintain the exchange rates of those, so that if I have a sales opportunity or I have something else that has a monetary value, it will show in the user's value when they see it. And in reporting, if you write a Power BI or SSRS report off of this, it will show in that way. Now, you do have to do some work. Mainly, it's not going to automatically update the exchange rates. There's services you can integrate to do that. But both of these are a huge help when you're dealing across geographies. And something, again, there's ways to do this with SQL, and you can build in Power Apps, put your translations in there. But I find the more that you do, the more bulky and slow the app gets, rather than doing it at the data platform layer. Next one, relationships. So if the app is relationship heavy, meaning it's not just one or two lists, but this is actually kind of a lighter data model that I might work with, where you've got an order process, or you've got a manufacturing process, or something like that. When I see something start with SharePoint lists, I always want to see, okay, how many different lists are we going to have? Because SharePoint is not designed to be a relational database. And so when you have something like this, where you've got parent-child relationships and things like that, CDS frankly just makes it easier, because I can go in, and SQL is very good for this too, but I'm just saying, this makes it very easy. You want to think, if I have a lot of relationships, I either want it to be CDS or SQL. If it's one or two lists, then, or maybe three or four, but something that I'm constantly updating multiple tables, because you've got a valid relationship between the data. So let me take you into the Common Data Service and show you kind of what I mean by relationships, and I think it'll make a lot more sense. Hold on, let me bring this window over. Okay, so if you have a Power Apps, and if you sign up for the free community plan and want to play with CDS, and I've got another offer at the end that'll help you learn it. So if I go into Power Apps and click Entities, if you are in an environment, not the default environment, but an environment that has Common Data Service, you'll see the common entities such as account, contact, currency, etc. So let me just go into, for example, the account entity. And this is from the maker experience. This isn't the user of your app. This is the maker experience. So you've got, in that entity, you've got the fields. So I can easily create a field. And many different data types that field can be. So the main ones you would expect, like text, number, date, time, but within these, they've got specifically formatted that have special properties, such as email, which is, it's looking for a valid email format, URL, hyperlink, ticker symbol. So if you use those in your Power App, it will actually treat it like I click on this, it then opens an email and has me do it. Date, you've got multiple date formats. You want date, time, or date only. And that's one other thing I'm using on localization. It has user context date time fields. So some fields, like a meeting, when a meeting starts, if you're on Pacific time or Mountain time, you want it to adjust to the user's time. And the standard date format is user specific. You're supposed to associate a time zone with that person. Now you don't want to use that for things like birthdays. You got people saying happy birthday on the wrong date if they're in the wrong time zone. But for some fields, that's another example of where that is. And again, you can very quickly create new fields and leverage the out-of-the-box entities. But for relationships, so for example, on account, you've got multiple relationships between different entities. If I wanted to relate this to another entity that I'm working on, I can simply add a relationship, one to many, many to one, many to many, and then can create that relationship very, very quickly without having to be a database administrator. And the biggest thing is I've worked with SQL. I've done a lot of SRS reporting a few years ago, but I can't trust that the Power Platform administrator at my client necessarily can keep it going. Where with CDS, I could train them. They can add new fields. They can add new forms. That's what I look for. Not just delivering something initially that's really cool, but also delivering something that I know my customers can support after I'm gone. And we will have a little bit more time for questions. So calculated rollup fields. So you have things like calculations inside SharePoint lists. What makes the calculations and rollups more powerful is, so first of all, calculation is similar in CDS in that the calculated field doesn't hold any data. It holds a calculation. So then if I view it in a list of records or on a form or in a Power App, it real-time calculates. So you want to get the average or get the difference. One thing it can do, though, that's really cool with that relationship capability, it can grab fields from related records and calculate with them as well. And then the roll-up fields can play with the hierarchies as well. So if I've got, say you've got the relationship of, let me go back to my my slide before where I showed this. Okay, so here we've got product inventory linked to orders. So I want to see on the, or let's take batches. So you got a batch, and then you link to that, you've got products in the batch. There's like 9,000 products in the batch. I can have a roll-up field on the batch level that gives me the total, and it could be a conditional, total as well. So that gives me the ability. That's a big help. If you know the concept of delegation, which is delegation in Power Apps, you have certain functions are delegated to the source system, and others, certain types of formulas, are not delegated, and they have a limit on the number of records you can use. So one of the approaches you can use with delegation is by adding rollups at the server level. You can get bigger data sets and bigger computations without any delegation. There's other ways to avoid delegation too. So by default, these are asynchronous, and they calculate, I believe, by default every 12 hours, and there's a system setting I think you can make that happen more frequently. But you can also, inside of a model-driven app, you can hit the recalculate button and recalculate that when you want to. So that's one thing that I found very powerful. Exchange and Outlook integration. This is something that comes from the legacy of Dynamics, but has now been offered to all CDS customers through Power Apps. And so basically what this enables is a connection between Common Data Service and Exchange. So for example, you want to have your app send an email out, or you want to have emails sent to an inbox that automatically go into your Common Data Service. Very popular for sales scenarios, or tracking of conversations between customers. I can hit a button and track an email conversation in my Common Data Service app, and it's available. So contacts, accounts, and tasks then will synchronize between Exchange and Outlook. So if I have a meeting entity inside the Common Data Service, which is a standard one, I can have records in there linked or synchronized with the user's calendar. So there's a little GIF here. So then it says Dynamics 365, but again, it's available for general Power Apps now if you have the full plan. So it'll show you right from within Outlook, the ability to track a record. I have an email, I want to track that. I can also from here search within the Common Data Service, open up any record, create records. If you got Outlook-centric users, it's a really good thing. If you remember back, if you had any experience with the old Outlook integration, the client-side one that had a fair amount of problems because it had to be installed on every computer, this is an Office app. So it sits on your Exchange account, nothing to install, very speedy, much better than what we used to have. I wrote books about the old one. I didn't like it. It caused more support calls than anything else. This is loads better.
A couple questions for you, Joel.
Yeah.
So one, can you connect the CDS to additional email providers like G Suite, Gmail?
It works with Gmail and Outlook.com. Now you'll want to check the documentation because the functionality differs. The best is with Exchange. So with Exchange, you get the full calendar integration and folder level tracking. The one thing didn't show is you can create folders linked to specific records, and you drag, if you organize your mailbox like I do by folder, anything you drag there syncs to the record. So with Outlook, Hotmail, and Gmail, you get, Outlook.com, you get more basic. You can still track stuff, but it doesn't have quite as full, sync integration for things like calendar.
And the other question is, if the app sends an email, will that email show in the user's sent items folder in Outlook?
It depends on how you do it. There are ways to do that. I believe, I can't remember off the top of my head what does and what doesn't. Typically, if the app is sending an email in the context of the user, I believe that does show in the sent items. And that's one thing to consider as you are creating. You basically have two options. Use Flow to send the email, or use CDS and the infrastructure around the Exchange Integration Center. There's pros and cons around both options. CDS gives you things like email templates. And what email templates are you can create templated emails that pull in text dynamically from records. So like you have a welcome email you send after you onboard a customer. That's really powerful. And what I find most powerful about that is it empowers the users to manage that rather than the Flow maker or developer to do it. And so since Flow doesn't currently support that, I like to use CDS for that kind of thing. It also shows them in the activity history. But the other thing that I think is pretty important, Common Data Service includes do not call, do not email at the contact and the company level. So things like the CAN-SPAM Act, the do not call registry, those types of things. This is pretty important. And just sending emails through Flow, it has no knowledge of whether Christian is set to don't email Christian. And you could get yourself into trouble doing it that way. If I have my emails sent through Common Data Service, it will be aware of that and will not send an email if that contact is set to do not allow email. Okay, good question. All right, and we'll have more time at the end. So real-time workflows. So if you've followed Dynamics at all, we've had workflows for years, just like SharePoint had workflows, and they were typically for things that happen inside the walls of the application. We use that for, and then we use other systems to integrate systems together. Power Automate has pretty much become the go-to background process for Dynamics. If you try and create a asynchronous workflow, a big yellow bar appears saying, we want you to use Power Automate. But there's still one type of process in Common Data Service that even with the age of Flow that I still use and is a big benefit for some process. And that's the real-time or synchronous workflow, because some things need to happen immediately. Some things user action needs to be an atomic transaction, meaning I want these three things to happen, and if they don't all happen, the thing should fail. Things like real-time validation when I commit a record, those types of things. So an example, you don't want to make every field in the form required, but before somebody saves and commits the record, you want to validate that these three fields are filled out. That's the real-time workflow capability. And so my rule is use Power Automate for the things that need to touch different systems and connectors. Use Power Automate for most processes. And it has a lot of capabilities workflow never did, like job scheduling, other things like that. But for things that need to be real time or need to be that multi-step atomic transaction, I would recommend real-time workflows. And that's one thing too, is that can be a help with your Power App, because I don't have to overload my app with all the logic when it makes sense for it to be a system level constraint or logic. And I might have 4 different apps that all do the same thing. Do I really want, if I want to make a change in it, have to make that change in each of the 4 apps? No, I want to do that in the common data service, and then all my apps they work that way. All right. And so the next item, the other thing that common data service gets you is the other types of Power Apps. So people think of Canvas apps when it comes to Power Apps, and that's very popular. But there's 2 other kinds of Power Apps that you should know about. So Canvas apps, we all know and love. They're the pixel perfect, task focused. User, you got the Canvas, you can build really custom user experiences, 300 plus connectors, love them. But you also have the need for the more data dense, relationship dense, and I'm going to steal a term one of my customers used this week. He said, we need the cockpit, which means we've got this app for people on the shop floor to scan stuff and do simple task focused things. But where's the experience that we're going to go to when we want to administer this? We want to view a bunch of records. We want to type in a bunch of stuff. We want to see, a master record with a bunch of child records. We want to see dashboards, all that stuff. That's really what model-driven apps. They're not driven as much by user experience, more by the overall more complex process. And then portal apps are if I want to expose something externally, meaning very quickly spin up a portal that people can view their data from CDS or create records. So when should you start with model-driven? And this is not an either or. The reality is, for most of the enterprise Power Apps I've delivered, there's been both Canvas and model in the mix, because you need the admin experience, you need the great user experience. And so you start with model-driven if it's data dense, process dense, relationship dense, or user dense. Not dense users, but lots of users, lots of processes. So you want to have a framework where you can very easily build out a whole sales process, including what the sales manager can do to manage that, or customer service process, or a manufacturing process. It gives you a very simple way to put the components together in a framework that can be used to administer very bigger or more complex process. I've got an example. The Canvas apps are more experience driven. They can be CDS, they can be whatever. But the beauty is, if you've got the users using doing the task focused stuff on a Canvas app, and you've got the administrators and the managers on the model driven app managing the whole process, it's the same system with the common data service. And then portals, anything external. Now you can build custom portals too, but it's very simple to take your model-driven forms and create a portal that's great for things like submitting a ticket, or some other things where users maybe need to update their customer information, integrate it with your website. It has some customization. It's somewhat limited with connecting to other systems right now, but as far as if you have a process that needs to either feed data externally or have people submit data externally, it also, in some cases, can be more affordable than buying somebody an external Power Apps license and building them a license as an external user. Because it basically, for like an anonymous, you get several 100,000, for pretty page views for a pretty affordable price. So let's look at this, specifically Canvas versus model. So this is an example of some of the stuff that's being done for COVID. So this is the Canvas app that is tracking things. We hear a lot of things about personal protective equipment and hospital beds. So this is something that we've got users at a facility that need to very quickly track, how many beds do we have? Where do we have needs for staff? Those types of things. How many masks do we have? Where are our ventilators? Those types of things. And this could be an organization that has multiple facilities, and they need to plan, how many people have recovered from COVID-19 and need to have maybe some connectors to some other systems. So Canvas app for people who are doing that is great. But what about the people at the headquarters? They need a way to see across all the facilities. So they're not just trying to do task-specific things. They're looking at their systems, their facilities by department. Where do we have shortages? Where do we have, extra equipment sitting around? Where should we move this? That's the perfect example of how, just having the Canvas app achieves one part of it, but without the cockpit, you can't effectively administer this. And that's where, again, if you have one SharePoint list and you are administering it from that perspective, that's okay. But if you have 10, 20, 30 different SharePoint lists, having that cohesive management scenario is not that easy with a SharePoint type thing. And if you build it with SQL, you've got to build some interface where the administrator can do this. And sure, you do a lot with reporting in Power BI, but Common Data Service gives them actionable data and the ability to manage the process. So administration and governance. And I've got 2 or 3 more items here, and a lot more that we could talk about. But let me jump in. So with Power Apps, if you're familiar with it, you get these things called DLP, or data loss prevention rules. But if you're on the Office plan, your administration is more limited, your governance more limited. For example, and again, correct me if I say anything correct here. I don't mind people calling me out, but based on my experience with the Office plan, your DLP rules are limited to the whole tenant. So you've got these 300 connectors, okay? You've got business systems like Dynamics, and you've got Salesforce.com, and then you've got fun stuff like Dropbox and Twitter and those types of things. And those are great, but you probably don't want people posting their content from SharePoint onto Twitter and things like that. So DLP rules let you control what connectors can be used together. But you might have different scenarios, like a real world scenario. I have a marketing person, and she does have a need to connect, Twitter with say Dynamics, or with SharePoint. But do you really want that to apply to all environments? And so, with that in mind, when you have the full version of Power Apps, which includes Common Data Service, you can set per environment DLP rules. You also get greater analytics. So yeah, if you go to data policies, if you have fully licensed for it, you can create a new policy and can make it either a global policy or an environment specific policy. And there's greater levels, but also with the Common Data Service, you get some great analytics around what's my database capacity and who's using what. So you can see in this environment, I'm just about at my capacity, but you can see total API calls, active users. You can download a lot more, equivalent to like the SQL top tables report you can get with the top entities, active use by entity, see what they're using, what they're not using. That level of analytics that, again, if you're doing an app for 5 people, you don't really need, but if you're doing an app for 5,000 or 10,000 people, then that becomes a big concern. And so point-in-time backup restore, I had somebody at one of my customers who exported data, imported in, and resorted the spreadsheet wrong. And all their company names were mismatched with the address. And so we can literally go in and restore point in time to any time in the last, I think it's 3 to 5 days. So I was able to go in and, to 5 minutes before he did that, and then restore that. I mentioned the AD security team integration, the CDS analytics. Again, you don't need these kind of things for all apps, but if you do get into more complex applications, that's a big value. And part of that goes into ALM, or application lifecycle management. If you are doing Power Apps or flows with the basic plan, you have the ability to import and export them individually, but you don't have any real true ALM process that can do multiple related apps and flows together. With CDS, we have this thing called solutions. And solutions are a container. Let me package up multiple components that could be entities, they could be a number of different things, they could be fields, they could be real-time workflows, flows, Canvas apps, model-driven apps, package them up together and move them, but also check them into my source control. It works very well with Azure pipelines and continuous deployment or continuous integration processes, and they are the preferred method of transporting and installing change environment. I see a lot of people building Power Apps and flows and just putting them in the default environment. That's great if it's a personal productivity, but that's a terrible idea if this is for enterprise. How are you going to change that without disrupting your users or avoid messing something up? You want to follow good practices. And so they're also a method for ISVs to capitalize on the Power Platform, because you can make a managed solution which you can sell to people, protect your source code, and still deploy dependably to your customers. And so there's two main pieces. I'm not going to get into debate about what's good, what's bad here, but the Microsoft's recommended way to do it is on managed solutions used in your development environment, and you basically use those as a backup to source control, and you transport to other development environments. Microsoft recommends, and I also do in my projects, use managed solutions when you move to production. This helps enforce source control, because people can't go and add new fields and change your stuff in production. Now, you have to have the appropriate rigor to support that. Like, you can't, if you trash your dev environment and lose your dev solution, you will not be able to make changes to your solution. But you need best practices of backing up to source control. If a meteor hits the Microsoft data center, knocks out your dev environment at 11 o'clock in the morning, you should still be able to have lunch that day at the normal time, because you have your source control and can spin up a new environment. And we talked a lot about citizen developers, but in my opinion, this makes Power Platform more of a valid development platform too. There's a very mature SDK. There's a lot of really good developer tools. All that stuff that came from the 15-year legacy of Dynamics is usable with Common Data Service. You've got a really good web API if you want to build custom applications on it. We didn't mention plugins, but those are great for more complex server-side logic. Check out for a minute, if you can, pcf.gallery. This is something that my MVP friend Guido, and I can't pronounce your last name, Guido, if you're watching this, sorry. But pcf.gallery, which is basically all the things with this thing called Power Apps Control Framework they're coming up, which are basically the ability to replace out-of-the-box components with JavaScript-based controls. So almost anything for both, originally for model-driven apps, but now for Canvas apps too, you can create your own controls this way. And if you're a developer and kind of worried about all the talk of citizen developers, there's plenty of future ahead for you professional developers, and this has the tools to allow that. And what I like is I can have something that can be supportable by non-developers, but can be extended very easily by developers, but in a supported way that's controllable, and it's not like we're building a whole custom app, because the framework of adding fields and other things is great. And then the community tools are extremely rich. The first one, and this is something I talk to people who have come from the SharePoint side and are doing stuff with CDS now, and they're frustrated by the things we've been frustrated with for 10 years. And the first thing I say, do you have the XRM Toolbox? So the XRM Toolbox, which is xrmtoolbox.com, is a community set of tools, and it's amazing how many tools there are. You can connect this to your CDS environment, and this is just the ones I've installed. There's a store that has a bunch more. I'm just going to call out a couple of them. Fetch XML Builder. By far the easiest way to build list records queries for your flows. Also building new views. Bulk workflow execution. Those real-time workflows I talked about, if you want to run them in bulk against 100,000 records, that's the go-to place. Bulk data updater is another great tool that allows you to bulk delete, bulk edit, bulk assign, the kind of thing. Hey, our sales manager left. We need to assign 300,000 records to this new person. I don't do it through the front end because the front end views are 250 at a time. I grab bulk data updater, and Jonas Rep is responsible for bulk data updater and for the fetch XML builder. Entity relation diagram creator, when my customers say, hey, we added a bunch of fields, we want a new data dictionary, I just fire this up and generate that. So this is something, if you don't know about, you should definitely download it, make your life a lot easier. Ribbon Workbench is another go-to. That's part of that, and that is Scott Durow, UK-based MVP. Microsoft, as they commonly do for model-driven apps, gave us a framework for updating the ribbon or the command bar in the model-driven app, but they didn't give us a UI to do it, where Scott then developed the UI to do it without having to go into the SDK. There's a configuration data migration utility that's actually part of the CDS SDK. And this is when I move a solution, I can get the entity definition, I can get certain pieces, but the main thing I can't get is what I call the configuration data. So if you have a table of countries, which is pretty common for lookup purposes for addresses, you can move the country entity, you can't move the data. This is that missing piece. So I can point this to a CDS environment. Now you gotta get on, it's a NuGet package that you download and extract. So there's a little bit of work to get it, but it's part of the tools. There's also tools like the plugin registration tool you want. But it's very helpful, and you can package that up with your solution. And that way, if you have a process that references, or even a flow that references a specific record, if you recreate those records without the IDs for the records, it won't work. So this is something you can have where you move the solution, or have your automated batch process move the solution, and then have it automatically move the data too. And then my colleague Andrew Butenko, MVP developer, he has this great ultimate workflow toolkit that has a bunch of missing actions that you can call from real-time workflows. And so that's another go-to. There's a bunch others, but if you're stuck and you're trying to do something CDS you can't figure out, Google Dynamics in there too, and chances are you'll find somebody with the answer. So my next to final slide, then a special gift for everybody here. I've come to peace that SharePoint people and Dynamics people can be friends. Because I have had cases where it's an app that fits very well in SharePoint, and you have a need to not have excessive license costs. So again, that's great having those options and having the ability to put data in other places besides that. I just connected to ServiceNow for the first time yesterday and was able to do a flow with it. So I mean, it's a new world where we're not just in the Microsoft or in the CDS or Dynamics space. But use the right tool for the job. For one thing, CDS has a great integration with SharePoint. I can set it up so it automatically, for every record, creates a SharePoint document library. And that way, understanding SharePoint's a much better choice for document and collaboration files than just storing them as blobs in the CDS. So for that, you can use them together. There's a great Teams integration too, where you can have the files in a team linked to a record and see that. And SharePoint's great for quickly modeling something. I will go and throw together 2 or 3 SharePoint lists, model it, but then I want to look at how is this going to scale? What are you going to do for change control? We need to have the rigors of a more enterprise-grade app. And then if I have something that I verify is a good fit for SharePoint, I would use SharePoint. But if I realize there's going to be a lot of relationships, we need the cockpit management experience, we need granular security, any of those things, I will recommend CDS for that. And again, if you have a lot of relationships and they don't need that admin side, then maybe SQL is a good choice. But there's no licensing benefit for going with SQL versus CDS. If you have a plan that includes SQL, you also have common data service. So the main thing there is, if they have a lot of other stuff on SQL and have a lot of SQL DBAs, and then I will sometimes use SQL, but cost is not a reason to not use CDS. And if they don't have DBAs, even more reason to have the CDS, which can be more easily administered by people who are not administrators or not DBAs. And then finally, I have a free offer for you. My friend David Yak, who's MVP in RD, He wrote a book on common data service. He's also made a class that's 6.5 hours long. So I didn't want to talk 6.5 hours, but he gave a special code for MAGA attendees. So you can go for limited sign up for that and take the whole 6.5 hour course, no cost. The code is CDS Joel UG 2020. And Christian, I'll share the deck with you after the presentation.
Awesome. Thanks a lot.
Any more questions?
Nothing else posted. So if there's any other questions, use the Q&A module. We've got another minute and a half here in the hour.
Yeah, while we do that, let me show you. I mentioned the community plan, but if you are itching to try CDS and you don't want to go spend money on a subscription right now, everybody could go to Power Apps Community Plan. Well, Power Apps Community Plan is, right here, Power Apps Community Plan. You'll want to sign up. I'd recommend if you are working for a large organization like I work for Hitachi, you'll need to use a Office 365, or I guess you call a school and work account. I've gone to set up my own Azure AD account. If you don't have another one you can use, but sign up for this, and this gives you a non-expiring perpetual Power Apps environment that includes Common Data Service. So you can go and take David's class, get your own non-expiring environment, start building Power Apps for education purposes on the Common Data Service. This is a great way to do it and be able to just quickly model stuff out and learn the platform.
We do have one question. Are there any tools or resources to help convert asynchronous workflows to Power Automate flows?
That's a good question, and unfortunately not at this time. I wouldn't be surprised if something did come out, but again, what I've done that quite a bit, and it's a good time to take inventory and do some house cleaning, because I've yet to see any workflows moved completely as is. Usually it's a good time to reevaluate. What I say now is, not that you have to rip and replace all your asynchronous workflows. Set a rule, we're not going to write anymore, basically, and don't add that, and then build a plan to move these over. For one thing, some things that in the past you have to use plugins, like if you need to update all the child records or things like that, you may be able to actually move some of your plugins to Power Automate to make them more non-custom pieces. And then just look at your workflows and see, now that we got, if you build your flows inside of a solution, you have child flow options. So a lot of those scenarios that we weren't quite at parity, we are now. So I would just look at that and just bite the bullet and inventory what you have. Move your biggest, most busy ones maybe first, and then some of them you may be able just to turn off or combine into a smaller number of processes.
Okay, and a couple other questions that came in. What are your thoughts on governance for what gets added to an organization's main CDS?
Control the cooks, meaning you need an environment strategy. In the old days, last year, we treated environments in CDS like gold. You would basically have to pay per environment, and it wasn't a lot. It was like 150 for a sandbox and 500 for production. But as a result, most people kept that number as small as possible. They've removed that, and now, as long as you have storage, you can spin up 25 production environments. So I build an environment strategy. I'm doing this now in internal Hitachi. I'm talking to customers about a lot, where we look at the types of apps. They usually fall into several different categories. One is personal productivity. I say have people have at it in the default environment. If you want to build a flow that within our governance rules will move something, when I get an email attachment, put them on OneDrive. Let them go crazy. We don't need the level of governance over that. Then you've got other apps that need to be shared amongst more people, but do they really touch our production data? Are they something that is important? Like I'm building an LMS now. but it doesn't really touch any of our customer data or anything that's in our production Dynamics environment. So we're putting that in its own environment. Other things, though, that do, you want to have more rigor around. You want to have people, establish your best practices around how entities are built and naming conventions, and then have a process where if somebody does have an idea or builds an app that they want to promote to that, you have people who can evaluate it, test it out in a non-production environment. Way you can keep control over what you need control over, but still empower people in your team to be able to automate their life and build those personal productivity apps. And then when you have the Power Apps and Power Automate or the Dynamics license, one of those two, you get more reporting ability about what flows and what apps are in your environment, so you can monitor that. And DLP rules just got a lot better, because besides being able to say what can work together, we now can ban certain connectors totally from a specific environment or from the tenant. So that, I think, will help you have a lot more control over what's going on.
And the one last question, here's just a quick and easy one, Joel. So if our company's interested in implementing Dynamics as a CRM, what would that entail to get it up to, let's say, Salesforce quality? Can you answer that in 30 seconds or less?
I mean, I could point to any one of our 3,000 to 5,000 user Dynamics deployments that have moved from Salesforce. So I guess you could ask the question the other way. I mean, I think, what I would say is generally Salesforce customers leverage a lot more add-ons from the App Exchange than Dynamics do. Part of that is the culture of Salesforce. But with these new capabilities we have with Power Platform and Flow and embedded Canvas apps and all the connectors there, I'm finding very few cases anymore where I have to use an ISV or a third-party app source solution. Now, if I'm doing CPQ or something like that, I will, because there's Explorlogics and others are really good at it. But the kind of stuff that we used to do, like even document generation, a lot of times we can leverage these tools, and being the CDS is shared by all these, we can leverage Power Automate and other things. And if you haven't seen Unified Interface and you're thinking of Dynamics as the classic Dynamics CRM, you really need to check it out, because it's a much more modern, much more accessible. It's built with accessibility in mind, where the old UI had inconsistent spacing and you couldn't tell where one section in and the other one is. No, this is a really, really much nicer, much faster, much more modern interface. And add to that, if you don't like it, just build a Canvas app for your users and make it whatever you want. And by the way, that works great with Salesforce too. So this, if you're not wanting to rip out for Dynamics, CDS has a connector for Salesforce Power Apps. There's more Salesforce templates in the Power Apps template library than there are for Dynamics. So, I mean, there's a lot of, I don't want to say most Salesforce people use Power Platform, but 93% of the Fortune 500 use it. So a good chunk of Salesforce customers are using these tools I'm talking about.
Excellent. Well, Joel, hey, really appreciate your time today. Thanks for presenting. And as you mentioned, so the recording of this session will be posted out to the Collab Talk page out on YouTube later this afternoon. Joel, you said you'd make your slides available as well?
Yeah, I'll shoot them to you.
Excellent. So I'll provide that up, and I'll post it out to my blog as well, and share that out to the social channels. And then just upcoming events. We've got some other guests webinars that will be coming up, is the Mugget Expert Series. And there's also, and Joel, you're invited to participate, but every Monday, if you're not aware, at 8 a.m. and 6 p.m. Pacific, we do Microsoft Community Office Hours. And so we have a group of us that just do an Ask Me Anything session. We're just online for an hour, so twice every Monday. So we hit kind of all the Americas, EMEA, and APAC in the evening. So they're Tuesday morning. And some great discussions that you can see the summaries of those out on buckleyplanet.com as well.
Yeah, send me an invite. I got to run, but this has been fun. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Joel. And thanks a lot, everybody, for attending. See you soon.